You wake to the sound of silk tearing. Not fabric, something deeper. The air around you trembles with it. For a moment you can't tell if it's a dream or the palace itself crying out. The scent of rosewater lingers, sweet but cloying, masking the quiet terror that seeps through marble in moonlight. Somewhere beyond the latticed walls, a girl screams, and every whisper in the empire seems to stop. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. You're part of a growing circle. Viewers tuning in from Istanbul to Jakarta, Cairo to São Paulo, piecing together the forgotten threads of human history. If stories like this make you pause, reflect, and see the past differently, leave a like, share this moment, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because tonight, across centuries, the empire's silence breaks for all of us. When dawn rose over Istanbul in the year 1623, the Topkapi Palace shimmered like a city of dreams. Its domes caught the first light. Its gardens bloomed in measured perfection. But beyond its beauty lay a truth only the servants whispered, that sometimes, in the dark before morning, the palace itself seemed to cry. Chroniclers never recorded the sound, perhaps because even they knew better than to write what power wished forgotten. It was said the cry came from the harem, a labyrinth of tiled corridors and perfumed air where laughter and sorrow lived in the same breath. Behind the gilded screens, over 800 women moved according to rhythms older than any of them. Silence, obedience, waiting. Among them, the daughters of sultans lived not as princesses, but as captives of ceremony. Their every motion was prescribed, their fates sealed in invisible ink long before they came of age. Fatma Sultan was one of them. Born to Sultan Ahmed I and Kosem Sultan, she entered the world as a symbol of divine favor. Chroniclers described her as radiant, her mind as sharp as a scholar's quill. She debated the movements of the stars, recited Persian poetry, and wrote letters that glowed with wit and grace. But none of that brilliance could change her destiny. For in the Ottoman court, a daughter's worth was measured not by her mind, but by how well she could be given away. As the empire reached its zenith, marriages were no longer matters of love or choice. They were acts of diplomacy, alliances written in flesh. Each royal wedding served as a signature in the empire's ledger of loyalty. And yet, behind the ceremony, a darker ritual unfolded, one meant to ensure that no princess, however proud or gifted, would ever stand as a threat to the order of men. The preparations began months before the wedding. The palace called it Terbiye-i Mubarak, the blessed training. But those who had seen it whispered another name, the unmaking. It began gently, almost invisibly. Fatma's daily tutors were replaced by matrons with cold, knowing eyes. Her books were removed from her chambers. In their place appeared mirrors, polished to a cruel shine, arranged so that no matter where she turned, her reflection watched her. The music lessons stopped. Her laughter, once a familiar sound in the courtyards, faded. Servants said that when she walked now, her steps made no echo, as if the palace had already claimed her voice. To outsiders, the harem was a world of luxury, gilded fountains, mosaics that shimmered like jewels. But to those within, it was a cage disguised as paradise. Every scent, every ritual, every law was designed not for comfort, but for control. Even prayer could be turned into obedience. Fatma's teachers instructed her to bow lower, speak softer, erase her will in devotion. "A princess must be as still as the water in the sultan's cup," one attendant murmured, "so that when he drinks, he sees his reflection unbroken." At night, when the call to prayer echoed over the Bosphorus, Fatma would retreat to the gardens of the harem, her only refuge. There, among the cypresses and roses, she whispered verses of Rumi to herself. "I am not this body," she once wrote on a scrap of parchment hidden beneath her pillow. But even the soul can be caged. Her wedding was set for the spring of 1623, to a man twice her age, a seasoned commander whose loyalty to the Sultan was to be rewarded with her hand. To the empire, it was a triumph of order. To Fatma, it was a sentence. On the night before her wedding, servants prepared her chamber with jasmine oil and silk sheets. The scent of orange blossom filled the air, so thick it turned the stomach. A physician prescribed a draught of poppy to calm her nerves, but the trembling would not stop. Witnesses later claimed she stood by the window until the sky began to pale, her hands pressed against the glass as if trying to leave through it. Then came the cry, a sound that tore through the palace before dawn, echoing off every marble wall. Guards froze in their posts. Eunuchs glanced at one another, knowing silence was safer than compassion. In the scriptorium, where royal scribes copied decrees, a single word was left unfinished on the page as the sound reached them. By the time the morning drums sounded, the palace had returned to its immaculate calm. Servants scrubbed the corridors. The scream was never mentioned again. But from that day on, every girl in the harem understood its meaning. The Golden Empire, they realized, was built not only on conquest abroad, but on the quiet conquest of its own daughters. As the muezzin's call rose over the Bosphorus, the light struck the domes of Topkapi, and Istanbul woke unaware. The empire appeared unshakable, its rulers divine, its walls eternal. But behind one of those walls, a young princess sat in silence, staring at her reflection until it no longer looked like her. And somewhere deep within the palace, a woman's voice, faint, unrecorded, seemed to whisper through time, asking, "What price does power demand of those born too close to it?" The answer would come in the rituals that followed, the ones no historian dared to name. The marble corridors of Topkapi never forgot what they were built to contain. Beneath their silence pulsed a system older than any ruler who walked them, one that called itself divine, yet functioned like an exquisite cruelty. What began as a simple preparation for marriage, the Tarbiyya-e-Mubarak, the blessed training, was in truth a quiet dissection of selfhood. The empire did not merely wed its daughters, it remade them, piece by piece, into living reflections of obedience. It started at dawn. The harem's silver bells chimed not to wake, but to command. Servants entered Fatma Sultan's chamber bearing trays of rosewater and ink-black coffee. Her attendants spoke in murmurs, never direct address. Princesses were to be observed, not engaged. From this day the training began. The first instruction was posture. "A daughter of the Sultan," the instructor intoned, "must never cast her shadow upon another." Her spine was straightened by force, her gaze lowered to the floor. Each gesture, each movement of her hands was rehearsed until it no longer belonged to her. The harem's ritual masters called it refinement. Those who endured it knew better. Within the mirrored walls of the Enderun, the women were drilled in gestures of servitude. Bowing became language. Silence became art. Even breathing was regulated, measured, delicate, a rhythm in service of grace. When a girl faltered, the matrons did not raise their voices. They smiled and began again, as though breaking a person required only patience. In the archives, a record survives, a set of 24 postures of obedience catalogued in the Risale-i-Terbiye, a forgotten manuscript now brittle with age. Each posture corresponded to a virtue: humility, restraint, devotion. But hidden among them were darker intentions. One pose, known as Sukut Unisa, the silence of women, required the initiate to kneel for hours with hands folded and eyes downcast until tears blurred her vision. The act was not symbolic. It was spiritual conditioning. Fatma's teacher, Gulbahar Hatun, had served 3 generations of princesses. Her face was carved from the same stone as the palace she guarded. "Words," she once told her pupil, "are the seeds of rebellion. A princess must bloom without them." From that day, Fatma was allowed only a narrow lexicon, phrases of gratitude, apology, and assent. It was said that she could no longer say "I," only we, and later, not even that. In the weeks that followed, her world contracted. The open gardens of her childhood were replaced with training rooms draped in red silk, air heavy with incense. She was made to practice the ritual of service, pouring sherbet for attendants ranked below her, combing their hair, arranging their veils. "Humility exalts the soul," her overseer declared, but every act stripped away another fragment of her dignity. By the third month, Fatma no longer protested. She moved through the rituals with quiet precision, her spirit drained into grace. To the empire, this transformation was sacred. To the women who watched, it was terror sanctified by ceremony. Each evening, when the oil lamps dimmed and the palace settled into silence, Fatma would be escorted to the Küçük Oda, the little room, a replica of the bridal chamber used for rehearsals. The air was cold, perfumed faintly with poppy. In the center stood a figure, a wax effigy dressed in the garments of a vizier. The princess was ordered to approach it, bow, and rehearse gestures of intimacy. Her instructors recorded every hesitation, every tremor. "Fear is unbecoming," they said. "Love must be learned." It was here, beneath the dim lamplight, that the ritual ceased to be instruction and became indoctrination. Each night she was asked to recite verses from the Nasihatul Muluk, a treatise on royal duty. Its passages spoke of obedience as virtue, sacrifice as salvation. When her voice faltered, attendants corrected her tone with a whisper, with devotion, not doubt. In the archives of the imperial treasury, one letter attributed to a palace attendant surfaces decades later. The princess was like a candle burning in reverse. It reads, "Every lesson diminished her until only wax remained. The empire justified it as necessity. A princess who carried the blood of Osman could never be allowed to challenge the balance of power. To ensure loyalty, she had to be remade into an emblem, an obedient daughter, a pliant bride, a silent diplomat. The ritual achieved all three. It fused theology with politics, turning submission into sanctity. By the time the first snows fell over Istanbul, Fatma Sultan was ready. Her tutors declared her purified, her voice measured, her posture flawless, her will erased. When she was paraded through the courtyard for inspection, courtiers murmured approval. "Grace incarnate," one called her. None saw the tremor in her hands, the glassy stillness in her eyes. In the annals of Ottoman ceremony, these preparations are described in glowing terms, the blessed rites of womanly honor. But the truth was whispered only in the servants' quarters, where older women crossed themselves when they spoke of it. They said that after the training the princess would no longer dream, that the ritual stole even the sanctuary of sleep. On the eve of her wedding, as the call to prayer faded into the night, Fatma's attendants found her staring into a mirror, whispering something they could not understand. The reflection trembled, as if the glass itself pitied her. When one of them finally leaned close, she heard the words, "I have become the echo of my own silence." No one answered. The ritual was complete, and beyond the palace walls, drums already sounded for the wedding that would end whatever remained of herself. The scream that once echoed through Topkapı had not been silenced. It had been perfected. When the Ottoman Empire fell in 1922, the world rejoiced at the end of an age. Empires, people said, die with gunfire and treaties. But this one left behind quieter ruins, rooms filled with portraits that never blink, diaries written in ink the color of grief, and silences so deep they seem to hum beneath the dust. For every fallen vizier or lost province, there were women whose pain had been archived not in text, but in absence. Their stories survived as fragments, their voices erased but never entirely gone. Princess Fatma Sultan lived long enough to see the empire that had shaped her spirit begin to rot from within. In the decades after her wedding, she became a ghost who breathed. Chroniclers note that she never left the palace gardens, never raised her voice, never smiled for portraits. Her attendants described her daily ritual. She walked the same path between the fountain and the cypress grove, tracing the identical curve of her steps as if following an invisible command. The rhythm of her movement became legend among the younger women, a haunting dance of endurance mistaken for grace. When she died in 1654, the physicians wrote a simple phrase in the death record, "Nefes kesildi." The breath ceased. No cause, no explanation. But palace rumor said that on the night she died, a sudden gust tore through her chamber and extinguished every oil lamp at once. For weeks afterward, no one slept in that room. The servants swore they heard her steps pacing long after midnight. 2 centuries later, when Sultan Abdülmecid's daughters prepared for marriage, the rituals had softened, but not vanished. The empire was modernizing, but its fears remained ancient. The Tarbiya-i Mubarak was now framed as etiquette instruction, the humiliation disguised as refinement. Princess Semil Sultan, writing in her memoirs from exile in Paris, recalled that she too had been forbidden to speak in her own defense. "They said the silence of a royal woman is her crown," she wrote, "but my silence was only a veil for their fear." Historians long believed these accounts were exaggerated. Yet in 2012, a cache of documents surfaced from the archives of Dolmabahce Palace, personal correspondences between imperial attendants, annotated with marginal notes in faded ink. Among them was a letter from a physician describing a condition found among several royal brides, melancholie gerdek, bridal melancholy. The symptoms matched what modern psychology would call post-traumatic stress. Insomnia, tremors, mutism, self-harm. The empire had medicalized their obedience, diagnosing trauma as temperament. By the twilight of Ottoman rule, as revolutions flared and Europe redrew its maps, the palace clung ever tighter to its rituals. The world outside demanded progress, but within its gilded walls, women still whispered prayers for escape. When the last sultan fled Istanbul in 1922, his daughters followed him into exile, carrying trunks of silks, jewels, and one unspoken inheritance, the training of submission. In Cairo, one of them, Adil Hanum, wrote to a confidant, "I cannot sleep without bowing before I lie down. My body remembers what my mind despises." The letter was never sent. It remained folded among her papers until her death. Scholars discovered it decades later, the ink barely visible. A reminder that trauma, when institutionalized, can outlive every institution. The legacy of those silent princesses did not end with the empire. The choreography of obedience, lowered eyes, measured words, the art of pleasing without voice, reappeared in royal courts across continents. In the early 20th century, similar bridal instructions were documented in Siam, Persia, even the Russian aristocracy. Power, it seems, teaches the same lessons, no matter the language, that control begins at home, and loyalty is first enforced through the body. Modern historians now view these Ottoman rituals not as isolated cruelty but as statecraft, psychological architecture meant to preserve the illusion of divine order. The empire trained its daughters as it trained its armies, with discipline, repetition, and the quiet erasure of doubt. What it never understood was that silence, when multiplied across generations, becomes an archive of its own. In 2021, restoration workers cleaning a sealed chamber in Topkapi Palace uncovered fragments of a tapestry depicting a wedding procession. The faces of the bride and groom had been deliberately unstitched. Only the outlines remained, golden threads looping into emptiness. Conservators believe the image was defaced during the empire's final years, perhaps by a woman who refused to let her likeness endure as a symbol of surrender. The gesture was both destruction and defiance, a final rebellion woven into silk. Fatma Sultan's name is barely remembered now, buried in footnotes and museum plaques. Yet her silence, multiplied by centuries of women like her, lingers in the spaces history overlooks. In the hush that follows a royal decree, in the careful way a court lady bows, in the unread letters of women taught never to speak. Empires rise on spectacle and fall to noise, but the Ottoman Empire did not end in a roar, it dissolved into quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after centuries of command, when the marble floors remember more footsteps than the world will ever record. And if you listen, truly listen, to the still air of the old palace at night, you might hear it, the faint echo of a woman's breath, steady, measured, refusing to vanish. For the empire is gone, but its silence endures.